I want to welcome everybody to this Myers-JDC-Brookdale Open Forum. Today's session is about the topic of ensuring a living income for the elderly. I'd like to welcome, of course, all the MJB committee and JDC board members and our friends. Of course, Ariel Zwang, our CEO, all the members of the MJB professional staff, including Michael Hartel, our executive director, Dr. Niamh Ringwerts, our chief economist, and Dr. Yitzhak Schnur, our aging team research scholar, who will be the stars of today's show. Throughout the meeting, if you have a question, please click on raise hand, and we'll have some dedicated discussion time after the presentation, and I'll be able to call on you at that time. As many of you know, Myers-JDC-Brookdale was established in 1974 as a center for gerontology to help the young government of the state of Israel establish best practices, programs, and services for what was then an aging society. Since then, of course, Brookdale has expanded our research and consulting to encompass many more populations and many more social challenges. But we continue to this day in supporting the government and addressing the needs of the aging population. Ever so more as Israel faces what we're calling a silver tsunami. Today, we are witnessing another phenomenon, which is ongoing poverty among aging Israelis. The cost of living is very high in Israel, you all know that, and many do not have pension funds to rely on, especially, obviously, immigrants. Today's open forum explores the challenge of addressing and preventing poverty among older adults. And so I'm going to turn it over to Michael to give us an overview.
Okay, thank you, Jody. Just this week, I heard the leader of a think tank here in Israel, and he said that the goal of that think tank is to make a dent in social policy in Israel. When I hear making a dent, I sort of think about my car, right, when it gets a dent. And this think tank, after several decades of function, says that their goal is to make a dent in social policy in Israel. So if a think tank like that is making a dent, Brookdale is inside the car. We're in the front seat. We're crammed up against the dashboard with the driver. We've got the map open, and we're guiding the driver on where he should take this car next. A lot of times we have our hand on the wheel next to the driver, sort of guiding them a little bit left, a little bit right, where they need to go in order to reach the goal. Brookdale is in the room where decisions get made in Israel, and that is a privilege that very few organizations can claim to have. What we'd like to do today is to take you on a deep dive into one of Israel's biggest challenges and to share with you what our analysts and what our consultants are doing to shape and to guide some of the most critical government decisions in Israel. I have to tell you that the ideas that you hear today, the slides that you see today, will affect billions of shekels and will affect over 1 million people in Israel. And it's based on what Yitzhak and what Yaniv will share with key government decision makers. We're going to be talking about poverty among the elderly. There's a very high rate of poverty among aging Israelis. Some estimates put it as high as 1 in 5 elderly people in Israel living in poverty. The cost of living in Israel is very high by international standards. And as you probably know, Tel Aviv was ranked the most expensive city in the world in 2022. And many elderly people in Israel do not have pension funds to rely upon. Now, back in 2008, Israeli law required employers and employees to set aside money in pension funds so that in the far future, this will eventually become less and less of an issue. But currently, many elderly, including but not limited to immigrants and those from lower socioeconomic strata, have little or no pension to fall back on. They live on a very, very limited government allowance that often doesn't sufficiently cost their basic cost of living, it doesn't cover it. And if they continue to work after they've started to receive these senior citizen allowances, which is often a financial necessity, those allowances are actually reduced. The two questions that we want to start with are, A, what is the government's responsibility in guaranteeing a minimum income for older adults? And B, should Israel allow people over 65 who continue to work to receive a full and non-reduced senior citizen allowance? To To start off, we're going to hand it over to our aging team research scholar, Dr. Yitzhak Schnorr. And afterwards, we'll hear from our chief economist, Dr. Yaniv Ringwertz, and they'll discuss why and how the Israeli government has developed economic interventions on behalf of the elderly. They'll also present our most current studies on the topic, and they will share the recommendations that they're making to government officials on how to reform the current policy in order to ensure a living income for older adults. So I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Yitzhak Schnorr. He's one of our most seasoned researchers on the aging team. I actually looked this up today before I came on the call, and Yitzhak has been here for over 27 years. Wow. In addition to his many responsibilities at Brookdale, he also edits our annual statistical abstract on the elderly, which is very generously supported by Nancy Hackerman, who is also here on today's call. The abstract provides extensive data on the elderly in Israel to inform policymakers and service providers. And so I'm going to ask Yitzhak to tell us how senior citizen allowances are structured in Israel.
Thank you, Michael. And hello, everybody. So why does Israel provide a senior citizen allowance, and does it help? To answer that question, let's first look at the demographics of aging in Israel and the development of the senior citizen guaranteed income policy. The population in Israel is aging at a fast pace. In the early 1950s, just after the establishment of the State of Israel, there were about 85,000 older adults aged 65 and over in Israel, less than 5% of the population. Since then, the number has increased more than 10 times. At present, we have 1.1 million adults aged 65 and over. Their share in the general population has increased from 5% to 12%. Looking at the map, we can see that the countries with the highest percentage of older adults in the population are Japan, Italy, Spain, Germany, and the UK. Israel is not at the top of the list. However, the older adult population in Israel continues to grow at a fast pace, and this has implications for society at large and Israel's social services system. The data presented here today are drawn from the statistical abstract on the 65+ population in Israel, published annually for 25 years straight by the Myers-JDC-Brookdale Institute. Let me take the opportunity to thank Nancy Hackerman for her generous support of the statistical abstract. The statistical abstract has become the basic tool for any work done in the field of gerontology in Israel, whether by academic researchers, government policymakers, or practitioners on the ground. So the National Senior Citizen Guaranteed Income Policy was developed in the 1950s. The majority of Israelis at that time were immigrants. Some of them were already old when they arrived in Israel. Most of them had no property and no financial security. Many were idealists, driven by the desire to build the state of Israel. They were mostly focused on the present, but did little to prepare for their future. Some were employed by well-organized companies that were aware of the need to ensure financial security in old age, and therefore established a pension plan for their employees. All other, and particularly new immigrants, were employed by less regulated companies that had no pension plan at all. Although the number of older adults was still rather small then, it was clear that in the absence of a national senior citizen guaranteed income policy, a growing portion of the population would reach old age with no source of livelihood and would become a burden on society. The question was how to design a national senior citizen guaranteed income policy. One of the options considered was a national pension fund that would include employee and employer contributions throughout the career of the individual. The senior citizen would then receive payments based on the sum of his or her contributions. The other option, which is the option that was eventually adopted, was a guaranteed income policy where the contributions to the pension fund would vary based on the level of the individual's income. regardless of the individual's contribution, the same basic fixed allowance would be paid out to everyone when they reach retirement age. This means that paying into the National Insurance Fund is mandatory regardless of whether a person is employed. Such a system provides retirees with a basic, albeit low, monthly income, which can be complemented by occupational pension payouts and private savings. The Senior Citizen Guaranteed Income Policy in Israel was thus developed on 3 levels: the basic level of a fixed universal allowance for all, the second level comprised of occupational pension payouts, and the third level consisting of private savings. The lowest level of senior citizen allowances is the widest, most comprehensive level since it is universally guaranteed. As you can see in the illustration, the basic allowance is also the lowest amount of income provided. The second tier represents occupational pension plans which cover a smaller part of the population while providing higher payouts. Lastly, on the third and top level, an even smaller part of the population has private savings set aside for old age. In the mid-1960s, it was decided to complement the basic universal allowance with a supplemental benefit, which was designed to support those who had no other income except the basic allowance. There were concerns that 2 socioeconomic classes of older adults had developed: those who enjoyed workplace retirement pension on top of the senior citizen allowance, and those who were not covered by an occupational pension plan and had to rely on the senior citizen allowance as their only source of livelihood. The goal was to help close the gap for the most vulnerable elderly by introducing an additional income supplement. In 1980, 45% of the older adults in Israel were eligible for the income supplement. The situation has improved since then. At present, the eligibility rate stands at about 18%. These 2 allowances, the Universal Senior Citizen Allowance and the income supplement, have been helpful in reducing the poverty rate in the older adult population. In 2020, the poverty rate among older adults aged 65 and over decreased by about 65% thanks to these 2 allowances. The graph shows the significant impact of the 2 allowances on the reduction of poverty in the older adult population. It should be noted that the poverty rate among older adults aged 65 and over is higher than in the general population. This can be attributed, among other things, to the massive immigration to Israel, which brought many older adults without pensions and the once low incomes and pension contribution level. But even today, there are still older adults who are not covered by an occupational pension plan and have no private savings, whose only source of livelihood is the senior citizen allowances. As the chart shows, after the government interventions, 1 in 5 older adults in Israel still lives in poverty. In light of this data and the expected growth of the older adult population in Israel, in 2022, the Minister for Social Equality asked Myers-JDC-Brookdale to examine and recommend potential reforms in the senior citizen pension and income supplement policy. We were asked to review similar policies in other countries and to perform a conceptual simulation of possible changes in the senior citizen allowances in Israel to identify which policy changes could best help the most vulnerable elderly. In a few minutes, Yaniv will tell you more about the work we have done and our policy recommendations to the government.
Thank you, Yitzhak. Basically, what Yitzhak has told us about now is the history of why not everyone in Israel is prepared financially for retirement, and about the system. Everyone gets a very small senior citizen allowance. Many people, but not everyone, has a pension from work, and few people have private savings that they have attained for their retirement. We will now turn to Dr. Yaniv Ringwertz, MJB's chief economist. Yaniv leads MJB's economic service, which promotes the use and economic methods, thinking, and analysis in all of the work that we do and our research teams across the Institute. In addition to working at the Institute, Yaniv is also on the faculty of the Division of Public Administration and Policy at the University of Haifa. One other interesting thing about Yaniv is that I never forget his birthday because we share a birthday, although he's many, many years younger than I am. And what we'd like to do now is to ask Yaniv to tell us about the options that we looked at MJB and about our recommendations to the government.
Okay, thank you, Michael. I just want to say that Itzhak's work with the statistical abstract, if I'm not mistaken, is one of the most downloaded documents in our website, maybe number one. So that shows you the significance of this work, the importance, not only from our point of view, but from a more popular point of view. So in this work, we decided to focus on on one type of allowances. As Itzhak was saying, there are in the first level, there are two allowances, a universal allowance and a selective allowance. And we thought that the selective allowance is more important to focus on, since this is the allowance which helps those most in need. Now, in the table that you'll see in a minute, you'll see some details about this allowance. This is actually a combined level, right? So this is the universal plus the selective. It's not what everyone gets, just those most in need. Now, it's a bit technical, but you know, the devil is in the details, so we need to dive into the details. So in the first row, you can see the maximum allowance before reduction. So people who are not getting any other income or very low levels of income, in Israel, they get almost 4,000 shekels per month. So you have 3,836 shekels. And if we compare it to other countries, all in new Israeli shekels, you see that the allowance in Israel is not that small. Of course, we're not as high as Denmark, but Denmark is sort of an outlier. And if we compare Israel to countries which are similar to us in the allowances system, we see that we're somewhere in the middle. You'll see afterwards that one of the policy recommendations possibly would be to increase the allowances, but since we see here that it's not that small, it's not necessarily the best option. So that's fact number one, the maximum allowance level, right? In the second row, what we see is the income test, right? So from that income onward, the allowances are diminished. So in Israel, until you reach roughly 2,500 shekels, so 2,479 to be more exact, you still get the number that we saw in the first row, right? So almost 4,000. Is it small or large? So we can see that, again, we have an outlier, which is the UK, but compared to other countries, the income test in Israel is fairly small. So it means that the allowances are reduced, starting a fairly low income level, right? By the way, since we're talking about highly technical details, so if you want me to stop and clarify anything, just let me know. If not, let's move on to the third row, and this is the allowance reduction for each additional shekel earned. So we said that starting to 2,500, the allowances are diminished, right, in a gradually, right? So what is the slope of the gradual decrease in allowances? In Israel, it's 60%. meaning that for every additional shekel, which is earned from other sources, not from the allowance, the allowances are reduced by 60 agorot, right? 60%. Is it large or small? It's somewhere in the middle. Denmark is more generous in the sense that the slope is flatter, so the allowances are not reduced in a fast pace. And UK and Ireland are more, I don't want to say cruel, but more strict in the sense that the allowances are reduced one by one for every additional shekel. So these are like the basic facts of the selective allowance system. It's of course very complex system, but here we're showing something fairly simple. So when we see this picture in front of us, and I liked what Michael was saying about sitting next to the driver. So we need to say right, left, straight, U-turn. So what do we say? We have here 4 options that we can suggest. The first one, as I said before, is increasing the maximum amount of the allowance. So from roughly 4,000 maybe to increase it. We decided that option 1 is not a good option for 2 reasons. First of all, the allowances were just increased recently by 700 shekels, so like two years ago, roughly speaking. So that's one reason. So this tool basically was already done. And the second of all, as you saw earlier in the table, the allowances are not that low. So number 1 is an option we chose not to recommend. Let's switch to options 2 and 3, which talk about these technicalities, right? The specificities of the allowance scheme, and it's again somewhat technical. Let's see the graph to give you our policy suggestion in a picture. By the way, we'll talk about number 4 in a few minutes, but I don't want to deviate from our focus here. So basically what you see here in the graph is the same table we saw earlier, but in graph format. And you see the Denmark up high is like an outlier. Denmark has a very unique system, very generous, but the other countries are fairly close to Israel in the generosity of the allowances. And you can see Israel in the blue. Here it's slightly lighter than Denmark, so light blue. You see that the allowances start at almost 4,000 shekels for income below 2,500. So that's like the straight line. And then they diminish gradually all the way to 6,000, where they basically reach the selective allowances reach 0. So you can see that Israel is somewhere in the middle, but what we think, and also based on Itzhak's work, is that the generosity of the system, which is fairly reasonable in the lower levels of income, is not that generous when we talk about income levels which are slightly higher. So that's one thing. And second of all, as Michael was saying earlier, the 60% decline in allowances means that people who want to improve their condition and work or maybe get income from other sources, they are paying a penalty of 60% for every shekel earned. We think it's rather steep compared to other countries.
So can we just stop for a second and make sure that we've all understood this complex graph and make sure that we're all on board with what you're showing? If we look at the individual lines, that shows us what the allowance is to start with, right? Yeah. And then we see that Denmark who is this here? Denmark has the highest allowance out of everyone, and that Israel is in a pretty good neighborhood with other countries about where the allowances start. But as we move from left to right, this means what happens to the allowance if there's additional income from, for example, working after the age of 65.
Yeah.
And we see that in Israel, as opposed to Denmark, where that allowance pretty much goes uninterrupted, regardless of the income, and it only reduces marginally or slightly later on. Israel's starts to go down as soon as there's an additional income of 2,500 shekels. The situation is, we could say, worse for people receiving allowance in countries like the UK, where immediately it starts going down and very drastically with a steep slope. And are you saying that these recommendations would move Israel from this straight line to this dotted line, and it would improve the situation?
Yeah, so the dashed line is our recommendation. This is, as Itzhak was saying, a simulation. Of course, policymakers can say we don't want 40% of decline in allowances, we want 50% or 55% or maybe 30% like Denmark. But this is a simulation to show a specific, this is I think 40%. This is a recommendation to show, a simulation to show how the system would look like if we choose a slightly less steep decline in allowances. And we have here two things combined, right? Number 2 and number 3. So we are raising the means threshold, the income test, from, or we suggest to increase from 2,500 to 3,000. So that's one thing. And the second thing is number 3, amending the income disregard, which is the slope of the line. Okay, so this is one recommendation or 2 recommendations wrapped together. Let's talk about option 4, which is concerned with a different topic, and this is the issue of indexation. So one of the concerns, regardless of what the exact mechanism we choose, is that the numbers would, or the figures, the shekel figures would lose their value as time advances. For one of 2 reasons. They can lose their value because of inflation, because of increasing prices, and they can lose their relative value if average wage increases significantly, and compared to that, the allowances maybe are not growing in a satisfactory manner. So we move in option 4 from a static view to a dynamic, to an over time view. And what we suggest, and this goes to speak not only about the selective allowance, but also for the universal one. So what we suggest is to use an indexation which is the higher among the 2 options. The one option is inflation, so adjusting the allowances to the CPI, to the consumer price index. Right, so if inflation goes up, the allowances would go up in a similar pace. So that's one indexation, and the other one is average wage. And we suggested that to pick the highest between the 2, and this would keep the allowances from a relative point of view and also from a price level point of view. Well, high enough and would not degrade the amounts or the purchasing power of the allowance over time. So I think with that I'm done, and I think back to you, Jody.
Yeah, and I'm happy to take questions. I'm curious though, before I ask people to just hit their raise hand or send a chat. How did the government of Israel come up with this minimum number, and how does it relate to cost of housing in Israel, which I know are very high, cost of food in Israel, which I know are very high? How does it all interact? How do they pick it?
Well, historically speaking, the amount of the allowance is a percentage of the average wage in Israel. It has been changed during the years as a result of indexation, political pressures, reforms that were made. So it is dynamic, but it is actually based on the percentage of the average wage in Israel. And the goal is to keep it with the average wage. So when the level of
standard of
living is rising in Israel, the allowance will rise as well.
Makes sense.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting presentations. I've got a question. May I just though preface it by a remark about the UK, since I'm the London School of Economics. Please note that in the UK, we've got two things. We've got the means-tested pension credit, and we've got the state pension. And the state pension is not means-tested, so a millionaire can still get the state pension. And that, though that was not always the case historically. And I wanted to ask you whether you had thought there should be a much less means testing in order not to disincentivize people over the pension age from continuing to work if they want to. Because here, I mean, I'm continuing to work. I don't lose, in principle, any state pension by doing so. So that's my question, please.
Yes, so thank you for that. So we, like Yitzhak was saying, we were talking only about the basic level. And it's true that in different countries, the other levels are sometimes different. So state pension and other pensions. So we're not covering this level. But regarding your question about selectivity, there's a big debate about selectivity versus universality, which I'm guessing you're well aware of. And our approach, which I think is very well contemporary in the sense that also in other countries, in Sweden and in other countries, they're moving in the same direction of selectivity. Now, if we have an additional shekel of public funds, we would like to direct it to those most in need. So if we have universal, allowances, the part of the money is, I wouldn't say wasted, so to speak, on people, like you said, on millionaires and people who don't really need the money. Now, as in every government policy, there are costs and benefits, right? So the benefit is targeting a specific population, and then you have the disadvantages or the cost of one of them. You mentioned that we're harming the motivation to work. And also when we have an allowance which is means tested and is not selective and not universal, some people don't apply. So and we see that also in other programs. And it's true, as in every government program, there are pros and cons, and we still think that also from a budgetary point of view, the pros outweigh the cons in this case. For selective allowance.
Is there any work done on how much a person can live on and live a satisfactory life as opposed to here's some money?
This is a good question. There was a work done by Professor Daniel Gottlieb, who was the head of the research department in the National Insurance Institute, and it was presented to the Knesset, but it didn't pass. Okay, it would be much more expensive to use this standard for allowances. So the work was done, but they are not using it.
So is it fair to say that the numeric value, the absolute value that we're giving today is based on tradition? Is it based on what we've always been doing, so we keep on doing it, as opposed to being really deeply rooted in evidence and in data and in the needs that people are experiencing?
To some extent, but I want to say another thing, that the allowances are not the only tool which is used to help the elderly population. And first of all, there are other subsidies which are tied to the allowance. So for example, local taxation is reduced for people who receive the targeted allowances, the means tested. And there are also other income benefits and also subsidy. So this is I mean, it's not part of this work because in every country there are other additional measures. I think in Denmark they have like an heating allowance that they give money because to people to heat their homes. So the system is quite complex in other countries as well. So if I need to defend the Israeli government, there are other tools which are used to help the senior citizens. And of course, things like health and other government services, which are also helping this population.
Terrific. Linda Spilka asks whether this policy recommendation and application changes now that the government may change. Is there room for flexibility? And I would add it, and maybe somebody could add, to what extent has this population organized itself? I remember 100 years ago, there was a pensioners party. I don't know if that still exists. Are people, is the voice of the covered heard in Israeli politics?
That's a really good question about what the incoming government will do. I think that is the strength of having an in-depth analysis like this on a program that's ready to go. This isn't merely an analysis of trends over time. As you've seen, this is an in-depth analysis of both an international benchmark and what the absolute value should be and what the rate of decline should be. This is ready for presentation to an incoming government. We'll be there to make that recommendation. We're all waiting, just like everyone else, to see how this government actually aligns and who comes into the positions where the decisions can be made. And it's a very tense and interesting time, and we will definitely be there to get in the room and around the table to make sure that this analysis is presented to everyone and to try to gently but forcefully and determinedly guide the decision makers to the place that we deeply believe is the best place for us to go.
My question ties to what you just said. Is there a current group? Are there advocates for seniors who are not part of an organization like ours? I mean, we have obviously some strength, but is there a more generally, broader based group advocating for seniors, if not a political party?
Yes, yes, there are a few groups of advocacy for the elderly. Most known called Ken Lazaken, yes to the elderly person. They are working in many frontiers. The pension system is one of them. They have also suggested a few reforms in the past, and we are in touch with I think with all of them.
Wonderful. Go ahead, Nancy.
Do you have champions still in the government, or who's on your team to try to get this passed, or do you think it's passable or not passable?
Well, I think the Ministry of Social Equality is a very strong, I would say, ally of us in this effort. But I also want to say something about the political atmosphere. Some things I think are sort of bottom up, and I think also the issue of elderly allowances is a bottom up issue, which is just coming from the public debate, from like a general public debate, from the media. So the media was very interested in our work, and from other places, because I think there is an understanding that the allowances are not large enough, and sometimes you get like videos or like pictures in WhatsApp groups that circulate. They compare the increase in allowances over the years versus the increase in the salary of Knesset members, right? So we see that the public is concerned with this issue, and it's true there's no political party that is pushing this agenda, but still it's a big concern, I think, for Israelis.
So I'd like to just add on to to Yaniv's point, and he mentioned the Ministry of Social Equality as a potential partner. As many of you recall, we recently added the Ministry of Social Equality as a core partner in our agreement with the Israeli government, so that we have good ties and a very great relationship with that ministry. However, it is one of the newer ministries in the government, and so I know that everyone has a certain level of familiarity with Israeli governance and with the executive branch of government. But ministries combine and they split apart, and sometimes new roles and ministries are created for different political reasons. The Ministry of Social Welfare, Social Equality, is actually waiting these days to see if it's going to make it through this round of the establishment of the government. If they do, and if they remain there, the Ministry of Social Equality will be a very strong partner, and we have very, very good working relationship. They've taken on specifically the aging population and the Arab population as two major population groups that they see themselves responsible for. And of course, we would be remiss if we didn't include the Ministry of Welfare and Social Affairs as being a key ministry in advancing the needs of the aging population. And there as well, we have very, very strong partners at the deputy director level who we've partnered with and worked continuously with. And they're ferocious advocates of good governance on behalf of the elderly in Israel. So we're actually pretty optimistic that we have good, strong partners in government to work with. And we hope that in the coming days or weeks that there'll be a little more stability and clarity, more to the point, clarity about who it is that we'll be working with.
I had a question. Oh, well, Max has one. Do nonprofit and claims conference subsidies impact these pensions?
Okay, so that's a good question. I don't know the full details. Like I said, it's a very complex system. When we talk about Holocaust survivors, they can get allowances from different sources. So if they get sources external to the government of Israel, then I think these are considered as income, and therefore the allowances are reduced. As for the Holocaust, I think there are Holocaust survivor allowances given by the government of Israel, but I don't know the details about that.
I think the fascinating piece here is how this all integrates with longer lives, better health for seniors, and ultimately a difficult job market for elderly people. So I think all these pieces of JDC's work in Israel are going to come together and put more pressure, frankly, as people live longer lives and seek to work longer on not reducing the allowance as much. So it seems like you're just in the right spot. I'm following with interest, and I wondered, Yaniv and others, whether you are looking at the literature in the United States around guaranteed minimum income and the whole notion that that everybody should have a basic level of income without reduction for other sources. It's a fascinating body of literature.
Yeah, well, it's a different topic. I'm familiar with this literature, and following the discussion that Rafael and I had earlier about the disincentives to work. Yeah. Then, first of all, it's not a solution for the elderly specifically, but it's a broader issue.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I can say two things. First of all, if we need to give income for other groups, not only the elderly, where are we going to take it from? Should we reduce the allowances given to the elderly and give to other people? Right. So I'm not sure this is where we aim. The second thing is that if we give allowances to the elderly, most of them are in an age that they're not working, or we don't expect them to work. But if we give the guaranteed minimum income to people in working ages, we certainly harm their incentive to work. That, by the way, can also harm them in the future because their pension would be small compared to the counterfactual. So I'm not in favor of this method, but it's like I said earlier, there are pros and cons.
I wanted to add a point that Yitzhak and I were discussing on the side here, and that is that while the elderly are 12% of the Israeli population today, they're actually 15 to 20% of voters. So it's a very significant chunk of voters that influence that I think that politicians, and like Yaniv was saying, there's definitely grassroots, but the politicians can't ignore this population. And so we're fairly confident. We were just before the government was dissolved, we were just at the point where they were going to pass a resolution, right? But because the government is changing, we'll see what happens with the new government, but it's very likely that there will be movement on this.
Great, wonderful. Anybody else have a final question or comment?
If I may, I was about to ask a very similar thing, that in the UK, older people are more likely to vote than younger people, giving them considerable political influence. I was about to ask whether the same applied in Israel. Kerry's kindly answered.
Yeah, used to be true in the United States too. Terrific. No other questions or comments. I'll thank Michael, Yitzhak, and Yaniv for a really interesting and important presentation, but more importantly, really important work for the future of our state of Israel and the quality of life of the elderly population. I think you might have picked up from my reference earlier to 1974 that MJB is nearing our 50th year jubilee. And the challenges of both establishing a state and building the society in Israel continue as Israel also enters its 75th year. Pretty amazing. So thank you all for caring so much about Israel and being here together with us, for joining this open forum. Your support, amazing to build the state of Israel. Take care, everybody, and I will see you in New York for the board meetings. I look forward to seeing you all and in person. Be well.